Good morning, everyone. My name is Ivana Zuzul. I'm the Senior Director for Europe here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And it is my great privilege to introduce a very distinguished panel to talk about some best practices in reconstruction. We have Mr. Mustafa Naim, who is head of Ukraine's State Agency for Restoration and Infrastructure Development, Susanna Kerr, Senior Vice President and General Manager at Jacobs, Andrew Torre, Regional President for Central and Eastern Europe, Middle East, and Africa for Visa, Andrew Patterson, Principal Vice President and Global Manager for Marketing and Business Development for Infrastructure at Bechtel, and Maria Lange, Coordinator of U.S. Assistance to Europe and Eurasia at the U.S. Department of State. Thank you all so much for joining us here today. And I would like to start by just for a moment reflecting on the history of national reconstruction programs. As we have heard this morning, partnership between international allies and between governments and the private sector has resulted in some extraordinary successes in redevelopment and rebuilding. And that's particularly true when those efforts have included planning and coordination among donors and stakeholders, and when they have allowed local institutions and local populations to play a part and drive the process. But we also haven't always gotten it right. So, Ms. Lange, allow me to start with you. How do we apply lessons of prior reconstruction efforts to ensure long-term success in Ukraine?
Well, thank you for having us here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the lessons that we have learned and we need to apply to the Ukraine situation right now. I think as all of the prior panels of U.S. government officials have commented, we are deeply committed to being with Ukraine for the long-term recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine. And so that is a given in our starting point, which makes recognizing the lessons and experiences from prior reconstruction efforts all the more important so that we get it right for the Ukrainian people. Just to give a picture of what our resource inputs have been to support the Ukrainians for the last year, we've put over $57 billion, the number keeps changing, $57 billion in assistance to Ukraine, including $18 billion in direct budget support, about $2 billion in humanitarian assistance, and almost $2 billion in economic development in areas such as agriculture, energy, and justice sector reforms. And so we've already provided a lot, and we're committed to working well in the future. Today, Ukraine, the devastation of the war oddly provides an amazing opportunity for Ukraine to reconstruct in a way that it wants to recover and reconstruct. And we need to all absorb some of the lessons from the past so that we do it right. I think one of the most important lessons that we need to learn and remember throughout the process is that Ukraine is in the lead of its own reconstruction. And I think what was talked about earlier, the G7 platform, Ukraine is the co-chair on that. Ukraine is providing the leadership on what that coordination should look like. They've also worked on coordinated with the UN and others in the World Bank on the needs assessment. The amount of $411 billion was mentioned for 10 years of reconstruction efforts. And so Ukraine is absorbing that lesson, and I think we, as donor countries, as partners, as the private sector, need to continue to recognize that and support that with technical support, with financial support, and not lose sight of that and not try to undermine at all their leadership role in that. Another lesson that has already been mentioned that I think is really important for us to look at is all reconstruction programming should be done in a transparent and accountable way. And that is most evident and will be most evident through looking the rule of law, looking at procurement systems, looking at corporate governance. People in Ukraine are going to be watching and watching this very carefully. So will our taxpayers, so will private sector shareholders. And so I think keeping those transparency and accountability aspects is always going to be front and center. A third lesson that has been touched upon is that we need to support certain sectors upfront and with great attention, including the energy sector, some technology sectors, because those are going to form the basis for private sector development and the spurring of the economy as it recovers and grows. And so paying attention to some of those underlying key sectors will also be important. Finally, the last one that I will just hit on is that the recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine is not just about infrastructure, it's about the Ukrainian people as well. So their health and their education and their participation in the reconstruction and the prioritization of those types of activities that we are all going to be helping Ukraine and engage in needs to be front and center and a part of our reconstruction efforts. So those are just a few of the lessons that I think we can learn from prior efforts. Thank you.
So much, and as donors and as governments have supported Ukraine through this process, the private sector has as well. And Mr. Torre, I wonder if you can share with us a little bit about how Visa has provided support for Ukraine.
Sure. We've been in Ukraine now for well over 25 years, and we've been working with the financial institutions in Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, really to digitize the economy and create a really great payments infrastructure there. When the Russians invaded Ukraine, clearly we shifted to be able to help make sure we could support our clients, our people, and the government continue to keep up, digital operational resilience. With our clients, we helped them. They had to overnight move data centers from parts of the country, either to the west or also in some of the neighboring countries. And we used new technology we hadn't tried, Cloud Connect, to be able to connect them directly to our platforms. And we had never done anything like that. We worked, we worked also with the government and with the banks to be able to try to make electronic payments not only resilient but free for a period of time, because it just wasn't cash that was able to be dispensed. So we did a lot of that. We also followed, the path of, Ukrainians that were fleeing the war and realized how important it was to be able to move money back and forth between folks that had emigrated out and people that were still back. So we worked with a number of companies, including PayPal, to be able to make remittances cheap and free. And we have also continued to support our own people there. So we evacuated over a couple hundred of our Ukrainian families, women and children, while we continue to support our Ukrainians on the ground there as well. Consistent with our values, we also suspended our operations in Russia. And we did a lot of work and continue to do a lot of work with the Ministry of Digital Transformation, and I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later. But that has been really, really important and consequential.
Mr. Patterson, you actually recently traveled to Ukraine to speak with Ukrainian and U.S. officials and to tour some sites. I wonder if you can give us some impressions from your visit, and do you see signs that we are starting to build the foundation for the type of process that needs to occur both now and in the future?
Yes. Yeah, I had the pleasure of traveling out there. It was the first time going back to Ukraine since the war. I spent a lot of time out there prior to that. Bechtel was looking at some of the key large infrastructure projects, including the ring road around Kiev. Bechtel's been in country since '91, helping out in various ways, including with the Chernobyl cleanup program. It was great to be back. It was great to be able to meet with the government and understand currently where they're at. We've stayed in touch over the last year or so and talked about what their program could look like. And it is clear, I mean, no doubt their number one priority is around the war, but really starting to put together a program led by Mustafa and ultimately Deputy Prime Minister now Kubrikov, which is just really some fantastic counterparts to be working with. Seeing that level of engagement, their seriousness about it, their capacity, their technical skills, and being able to help develop this, to your point, this really does need to be seen as a government-led, Ukrainian-led, and I think this is very different from past reconstruction efforts of how do you help from a private sector, how do the agencies, aid agencies and donor countries support a program that is ultimately Ukrainian-led, that can unlock and create the foundations for the infrastructure development or rebuilding of it. There's clear signs of rebuilding going on already, and they're prioritizing some of those projects. And I think some of the conversations that we had with the government was, what does this prioritization program look like? Because I think ultimately, both from aid agencies out there, donor money that's going to be looking at it, as well as private sector, they're going to be looking at what is that clear path of prioritization with the amount of critical needs that they have and the devastation that's happened, understanding where private sector can pursue projects and how can we help develop capacity inside the government to go deliver these. We often hear of private-public partnerships as the solution, and often that's seen as, I think, this free financing comes in. But there's all sorts of structures of what that could look like. And that could be looking at bringing in the technical assistance on a national program level, or it could be looking at how could you unlock other types of financing, including ECAs and DFIs, as well as ultimately looking at what will ultimately be a longer-term private sector investment. We got to remember, private sector investment on pure privately led projects, they take years, if not half a decade or more, to be able to put in place. And these things will, once we start seeing a clear sign that private investors can go into it, it's going to be at least 3 or plus years before that investment's actually going to be realized and construction and projects are going to start.
Let's actually turn to the government of Ukraine. Mr. Naim, thank you so much for traveling to be with us here today. The government recently established the State Agency for Restoration and Infrastructure Development. The agency will be tasked with prioritizing and launching the first reconstruction projects and coordinating interaction with donors. And I wonder if you can highlight for us a little bit some of the work that the agency will be doing, how you see this process unfolding, and how the government hopes to connect and to coordinate with international partners.
Thank you very much for your attention, for your support and the attention to this topic. I would start from our topic, our discussion, and I'll try to be as more open as I can be for this issue. First of all, when I'm talking about best practices for reconstruction and recovery in other countries, I would say that what I see is this big mistake now to approach Ukraine the same countries which United States and other countries did before. I mean, talking about Afghanistan, Syria, and other countries, and that's the biggest mistake. And I think for many people in this audience, and for those who are involved in this process, it's very important to understand what is difference. The main difference is that Ukraine is not a failed state. I mean, from the start of the war, we are still working. Bank system, government, local authorities, everything is working despite war. And that means that when you're coming to restore something in Ukraine, to rebuild something, you encounter all this complexity of the project. I'm talking about regulation, procedures, legislation framework, everything which you have in other countries, European countries. And that means that we cannot approach the restoration of the Ukraine the same way. It's not greenfield. You cannot come and rebuild everything from the scratch. The second issue in what is different is that in Ukraine, we have different strategies which was developed before war, and we have different strategies toward all this restoration and master plan for the country. And I think it is very naive and a little bit optimistic to expect that country which is in war now, this moment, that they will approach and will come with some strategic plan for restoration recovery. And that sometimes is a little bit sad for me when we're talking about with our partners and they say, do you have strategic plan? No. And it's not something that we are not doing. It's impossible to do that when you're under shelling. Of course, we have our strategic vision how it can be done, but we doesn't have some strategic vision for those cities which was destroyed totally, for example, Mariupol, Izium, or other cities. It's impossible to have it. What we can do is just change our approach, common approach to these processes, and what we can say to what obstacles we will have in future. First, and the biggest one, it is absorption capacity of the country and IFIs and those institutions which will be involved in restoration. Ask everyone who is working in Ukraine, how long does it take to implement some project with IFIs? It's years. One project. For this moment, our agency gathering inquiries from 11 territories which was mostly affected by war, and we have 11,000 inquiries, 12,000 inquiries. Most of them it was damaged or destroyed during war. How many years we are going to rebuild these facilities with the same procedures which we'll have now? I think it will take ages. So it is not only about Ukraine, it's also about IFIs, which should change their procedures. And that will be a call of Ukrainian people and those who are now involved in this restoration process now on the ground. We have 2,000 people in the ground, 24 offices of restoration, agency of restoration, and they are screening all these projects. And a little bit, it's scary when I think what will be the answer of IFIs if we will approach them and pitch them 11 design documentation. Imagine it. It's first, so absorption capacity of all of these institutions. And of course, it's absorption capacity of Ukrainian people and government also. Because when we are talking about structuring projects for IFIs, for international partners, it means international standards. How you can imagine that we have people in Kherson region, which is totally without administration, which are still damaged, still shelled? Do you really imagine that there are ecologists, sociologists, legal experts, financialists who can prepare these projects? No, we don't have them. So we should prepare it. And this time, till end of the war, this is time for us to prepare for this and prepare all these standards and institutions. The second issue, and I will be openly say about that, I think all of you heard concerns about corruption and vested interests. Of course, and it's not only sin of Ukraine. And it doesn't mean that we can clean everything after war. But it cannot be excuse for our partners to stop their cooperation. What we propose, and our agency and our government propose, let's do it together. We are very open. We signed memorandum with National Anti-Corruption Bureau. All of them then can come to our office and be very open and take all documentations. We are ready to implement all international standards of procurement in our agency. We are talking about compliance officers on the ground and the central office, but please let us know what kind of reports you need. When I'm talking with IFIs, with our partners, I'm always hearing these concerns that, it should be transparent, and I'm asking what kind of information or procedures you need to be confident that everything is okay. And I'm not hearing the answer. I want to hear this answer. How you want to control us? If you want to come to Kyiv, welcome. We are ready to put your officers on the ground. If you have your procedures, welcome. We are ready to implement them. But please, it cannot be this position that Ukrainians are always corrupt, that Ukrainians always can do that. It is not that. We are ready to work open. We are ready to open all our procedures and documents, and war actually showed that we can do it. Especially when we're talking about aid to our defense, the Ministry of Defense, and to all our restoration processes, we're still managing to do it in a transparent way. And I think that it's very important to change approach of our partners towards Ukraine on procedures and transparency in anti-corruption policy, and start to do something now, to prepare our plans now, before war. And last thing which I want to say to our partners is that our agency is the main dream and our inspiration is to bring our people come back to Ukraine. This is the main topic, because if you are rebuilding something, you are not rebuilding just to have beautiful building or beautiful school. You should bring people back. But it's also about economy. It's not only about social infrastructure, heating, utility, or substations, or energy infrastructure. It's also about business. We should restore our business. And I think you should look toward this opportunity to restore and to recover Ukrainian business on the ground, not only in Kyiv or in the western region, but on the eastern regions, in Kherson, in Kharkiv, and other territories. Without that, people will not come back, even if we will restore all our country, and if it will be very, very beautiful and modernized and by all standards we have around us. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ms. Kerr, I wonder if I can ask you to please reflect a little bit on that. I mean, clearly this is going to be a multi-year, multi-stakeholder process at an enormous scale. So what kind of challenges do you think the government will have, and how can U.S. companies and the U.S. private sector as a whole help?
So I think there are a couple of ways to approach that. One, I want to lean into the comment Mustafa said that this is kind of, Ukraine is in a unique situation. This is not lessons learned from Reconstruction in the past. This is really a once-in-a-generation challenge. The scale, the partners, the competing priorities, the timelines are just monumental and very different. So the focus can't be upon the word reconstruction, but I think we're really looking at future creation. It's a new economy, it's a new type of environment, and it's an opportunity for Ukraine can kind of lead the way. But you also have some competing priorities. You have the folks that are there now. My colleague here talked about his team on the ground. I have a team on the ground. We're dealing with real-time issues of keeping our teams safe, their families safe, working with our partners in Poland and Germany for working with the refugees in order to prepare them to go back. So there's the immediacy of now. There's the looking at the rebuild of what we currently have going on, but then the future rebuild, and then integrating and weaving in with that the requirements of the EU. So you have a lot of moving bits and pieces, and so you really need to think about it with a different mindset, which I think was the point that Mustafa was making. So as it turns to the US companies, I think, and certainly I think for many of the partners in the room today, I think we can bring an innovation mindset. I know at Jacobs we very much focus on the phrase challenging today, reinventing tomorrow, and really challenging at the core of what we do, of what can we do that really looks longer term, looks at bringing solutions that are going to be impactful, make the world smarter, make it more connected and more sustainable. And so again, I think those types of mindsets is a unique area where, within the US and many of the companies here can really help bring that thought process to the table for something that is really unique and different.
Thank you so much. And it seems that a common thread from everybody has been that public-private partnerships are really going to be the cornerstone of this process in every sense of the word partnership and across multiple questions. Mr. Torre, I wonder if you can share with us how public and private sectors can work together to build this foundation for a dynamic economic recovery.
Yeah, thank you. A great example is the work we've been doing in Ukraine. So in 2019, the government asked us to help them digitize some of the government services. And they wanted to be able to transparently, seamlessly, frictionlessly collect payments from citizens. And it has real impact, that's real innovation. So we wanted to help them enable that. We used our e-commerce gateway to be able to help them do that, integrated it into the government's tech stack, which has grown over time. So that happened. They've got about 120 e-government services now that are online and continue to grow. During the pandemic, they realized, though, that they wanted to be able to nudge consumers to do the right thing. So one of the things they wanted to do was to get citizens to get vaccinated. So we helped deal with the disbursements that were basically the prize if you were to get vaccinated, and that was called e-aid, which really foreshadowed, although we didn't know it at the time, some of the things that were really going to be needed, post the invasion, being able to do disbursements as well. So we've continued to help them with that, and they've continued to grow the level of ambition and the level of services. So they realized to be able to have impact, they need to get every consumer, every citizen in Ukraine digitally connected. So we've been working with them on, if someone is not financially included today, what can we do? How can we get them to have a banking credential and be included? So we've been able to work with the government to be able to issue 12 million of these new credentials. So that work has been really impactful, really consequential on the ground for people who need it. And then the other thing I'll say that we've done with our public-private partnership is we as a company have a foundation, and we very, very strongly focus on small and micro businesses. They're the backbone of economies, and we really want to be able to help them. And certainly it's been incredibly challenging in Ukraine since the invasion. And we have helped DIA rebuild, and we launched one of the first ones in Bucha, a business consulting service, to start to get that reconstruction on the ground.
Ms. Langi, a point that we touched upon was this need for capacity building and technical assistance, not just financial assistance. Is the U.S. thinking about how to best provide that? Is it working to best provide that?
Yes, thank you. So I think I did mention that one of the lessons is that this is Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery, and we do look to Ukraine's leadership to tell us where they want to go. And we and other governments are very, very anxious to be supportive as we can by providing technical assistance, technical advisors to the government on a range of issues. And I think we're very fortunate that for decades, the US government has had programs on the ground in Ukraine doing just that. US Agency for International Development has advised and is continuing to advise heavily in the energy sector, on cybersecurity, in the justice sector. And so thankfully, we had a platform from which to start a year ago, and we are in constant contact with various government ministries and are able to respond, I think, pretty quickly to government requests. Other countries are doing the same. International financial institutions are doing the same. So I think that the strong diplomatic communication in Kyiv is really critical to us being able to listen, be responsive, and do what we can. We also, we're getting ready to respond to a request on transportation. A request was made for advisors. We're going to do that. And so we're very, very excited to be able to help fill those gaps.
You mentioned using this time now to start planning for a future process. And the government has, in fact, identified some areas that it is prioritizing for investment and development. I wonder if you can tell us just a little bit about that, but also what it means for how your agency and how the government as a whole will be looking to really spur development of those sectors.
I think the hotspots of Ukraine for now, it is our war and what going on the east side and export. Because, you know, because of a blockade of our harbors, the main problem of our business to export their products. And of course, we cannot expect that harbors will be open next even 1 year or 2 years, because even after war, we should have time for demining this area around our harbors, and it takes a year even more. So what we propose, and actually that's what we're discussing now with our international partners and also with the United States, is that expanding our capacity to export our goods in an alternative way. It's first of all borders, checkpoints, it's roads to the checkpoints, it's railway stations, intermodal stations, and that is very profitable part of the business, and we are expecting for the partners for this issue, and that's crucial for us. And the second issue, when we are talking about assistance and about preparing, and I'll come back to the procedures, we have solution for that. We can do so-called advanced procurement office or project implementation office in Kyiv, which consists of the representative of all IFIs and member states or other states partners, which can do all this clarification of the projects on the ground in Kyiv, not on Brussels and Washington or other countries, which is very difficult, especially when talking about legal department. We have this approach, and we actually pitched this approach to World Bank, to European Investment Bank and EBRD, and we are waiting for this feedback. I hope that will be unified procedures for all these projects, because if we are talking about procedures, we understand why it happened before us, because everyone should be confident on the transparency and accountability of the process. But if you're establishing your own office in Kyiv with these certified experts, what is the difference? I think it can be the biggest impact to Ukrainian people for this moment, to make this training center for these experts, to have this project implementation unit in Kyiv and on the ground, which will help Ukrainian people, a local authority, to prepare their projects. We cannot force them to do that. We just can assist them. I think that is the most hotspot now.
Thank you so much. Ms. Kerr, how important do you view the need for the government to prioritize key sectors and capabilities that are required for reconstruction and redevelopment?
So I think, the short answer to that is I think it's critical. However, I know, part of our discussion today is really focusing on public-private partnerships. And so I think some elements of that is really how do you foster collaboration? How do you provide for the continuity? Because this is going to take time. And the priorities are probably going to change or evolve as time goes on. So I think in order to do that, I know there's the setting up the different units and sectors. I think there's also a big belief, and one thing that we tend to focus in on is how do you create the stable framework that will serve as the building blocks to really help with the prioritization, especially when priorities are going to change as it has to be a dynamic environment. So, what is the vision? How do you create an element of transparency and performance management? Interface management is going to be absolutely critical. Approaching this with kind of a holistic and integrated approach, and that kind of goes back to my point earlier where you have all these competing priorities with joining the EU, with the rebuilding in country, with the day-to-day of people that you're trying to work with. We've talked a little bit about clear governance and structure, a leadership culture that comes from the top down, and then really just being proactive around controls and change management. Change is going to happen, things are going to evolve, so how do you create the processes that will help enable that, track that, and again, keep it as transparent as possible. So again, those are just some ideas, and they're scalable from stuff like London Olympics to Sudaling to rebuilds, in other countries. But again, I think the thought process going into it is going to be critical.
Mr. Patterson, again, coming back to this idea of public-private partnerships, governments and donors will need to lead with the first kind of role of funding to lay the groundwork for private sector to be able to come in. What will it ultimately take for the private sector to begin participating in Ukraine now? And then also hopefully open door for private enterprise and true kind of open market private enterprise in the future?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, one of the key things here is to understand is private investment coming into Ukraine, going into any country, even in places looking at the US and UK. You're talking about things that take 3 to 5 years at least worth of planning. So they're facing even more of a challenge with the security situation going on. And so we have to be able to unlock it. And I think the key is people have to understand that having a clear path of here are our prioritized projects that we're going to help lead the way from donor agencies, from agencies in a coordinated approach that's going to help ultimately bring the confidence and actually attract international companies to be able to come in and help deliver some of those projects that are funded through these aid agencies and donor organizations, to be able to then bring confidence, say, if they can operate in Ukraine right now, then ultimately private investment will follow behind that. But private investment is most likely not going to lead the way in this, and being able to clearly demonstrate clear programs and projects that are being delivered with the support of private donor agencies and other agencies out there under the national program is going to bring that confidence behind it. The other thing is, you got to recognize that when we're looking at what this programmatic level looks like, it's got to be something that creates flexibility. So there's not too much rigid of all these requirements to unlock the funding. I think this is some of the things we've seen in some national programs, and we have multiple agencies involved in it, is they all have their different criterias and these huge hurdles. So how do you make that as concise that brings the confidence of being able to monitor, track, and make sure that the funds are going into the right directions? And also, I think one of the key things to look at is the procurement process. It's not a one-size-fits-all. In some cases, you need to be looking at variable procurement options, some that allows for direct negotiations to go happen very quickly, some for very rapid procurement processes, and some maybe more complex, bigger projects then can go through the traditional route. But if we think back at what a typical procurement program looks like, it usually takes a good 18, 24 months from start to finish of a procurement. And so in this case, you got to be looking at flexible approaches.
So much. Ms. Kerr, I'll actually ask you to follow up on that. And what would be sort of the 3 things that you would need to see in place to successfully enter the Ukrainian market for reconstruction?
Well, I want to acknowledge that many of us are already part of the market, so
yes.
it's kind of what to encourage us to increase.
I guess speaking
more
broadly for the private sector.
So
Correct.
I think some of the stuff we already discussed earlier today, which is really tackle the barriers early. So transparency is a key thing. How do we allow for privatization to help jumpstart parts? And so what barriers can we clear out of the way of that? Legal, dealing with contracts, the ability to do business. I mean, just the basic fundamentals of doing business. So I think that's number one. Make it easy to operate. So if folks are going in country, if they're partnering, who do they go to? Who do they talk to? Is it clear, what the key, talking about the priorities, where the focus needs to be? So how do we simplify that process and make it as clear as possible? And then incentives is probably the wrong word, but obviously there's kind of the international funding support, which we've talked about, how the funding occurs. But I also think there's a lot of focus on the business-to-business experience. So, again, for many of us that are global businesses, we have teams in Ukraine, so it's really building and enhancing those teams. But then it's also partnering with this, we talked about the micro and the small and the medium-sized businesses. This is going to take a team effort. Everyone's going to have to get involved. It's going to require partnerships. So what can we do to really help enhance those opportunities and really help bring folks back to Ukraine and grow the local economy as well?
So much, and just for our last part, and I'll have to ask everybody to keep their answers relatively short. I'd like to turn for a moment, lastly, to talk about governance, because it seems like that's going to be the key here. And it's governance, good governance, not just in state agencies, but also among companies. In 2013, the Chamber launched the Business Dashboard, and we found that markets that rank highly on the dashboard are those regions that have good governance frameworks. So, Mr. Torre, can you offer your experience? As a U.S. company, how can you contribute to good governance?
Yeah, I'll just use again the example of DIA in Ukraine. So it started with a big, bold, and compelling vision, which was Minister Fyodorov's vision of providing really efficient government services and improving the lives of its citizens. And then he has worked with different partners, private sector as well as public sector, to realize that and bring that vision to life. And it's been really incredibly powerful. In fact, it's become for us and for many countries a beacon of what good e-government services look like. You really do have now the state on a smartphone. It's accessible, it's transparent, and it provides real tangible benefits. In fact, the minister himself has been really pushing and promoting good governance, across the world and across the region. And they've started Eastern European Foundation, and we just, our Visa Foundation approved a grant to be able to help him and the Ukrainian team and other governments to be able to continue to follow. And I think what are really, really big footsteps that the Ukrainian government has taken.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Patterson, I would direct a very similar question to you. How can the private sector help uphold transparency and predictability and accountability?
Yeah, I think one of the best ways they can do it, and trying to be real concise, is around private sector operating there. When you get Western companies like U.S. and European companies operating there with the way that we do business and the ethics and business behind it, that is going to demonstrate, when you look at procuring to local companies and working with them, it's going to demonstrate a way of business practices that can be done, as well as bringing our lessons learned on how to operate in all these challenging environments under rapid programs, under national level programs, and working with governments, including the government of Ukraine, on bringing those best practices on a very flexible and agile system.
Ms. Langi, how can we work, our government, international donors, the private sector, to model good behavior, to ensure good behavior, and to kind of drive an ecosystem of change and transparency?
Well, I think as we come to Ukraine, as we partner with Ukrainian entities and Ukrainian people, I think we need to come modeling good and ethical behavior. I think we need to demand transparency and accountability in our transactions, and I think we need to be good partners and good neighbors as companies are coming in, as we are coming back to Ukraine. And remaining in Ukraine, I shouldn't say back, but we need to recognize that we are, as a company coming in, part of the community, and we need to appreciate the social responsibility that we have to help and work with our neighbors to make Ukraine a better place. And so I think that's how we can all do that. And we can also, this is an overwhelming reconstruction and recovery, and it's going to take years. There's a lot of us that want to help, that want to be there, and we do, I think, have to appreciate the pressures on the government and think about how we can kind of collectively put our voices together and streamline some of our interactions to make this easier. The coordination platforms help, but I think business associations help, sector, chambers of commerce, consolidating our views, I think, can help make this an easier relationship.
Mr. Naim, I really appreciated your message of reform, and I know that the agency has announced that that is sort of at the heart of its operations. And as we think about this process long term, it's not just this year, it's not just next year. How do we ensure that that is continued in key sectors, but all over the economy.
Coming back to transparency and to this accountability, and about digitalization in Ukraine, you know that Ukraine is perfect on that in many areas. In our agency, I think in future, and this future is coming, I hope in June, we will propose a digital ecosystem for accountable management. It's Reconstruction model, it's digital platform, and the abbreviation is DREAM. This model and this platform will allow each and every stakeholder, starting from IFIs, member states, state partners, local authorities, central government agencies, and each and every citizen of Ukraine to come and see each and every project of restoration, starting from the scratch. I mean, when we're talking about design documentation, procurement system, who is contractor, who is actually doing these projects, who benefits from these projects, and we can ask this information for each and every region. And all this system will be presented by our ministry, I think this June. At the end of the year, it will be fully work for everyone. I think the transparency and the open data, it is the biggest guarantees for accountable management of all these kind of process. So I hope that we will, and all our partners will be satisfied on that. And about long-term issues, yes, it is not 1 year. I think it will take years. And it's, of course, it's big risk of when you change power in country, change political situation in country. So that's why I think these digital platforms and accountable institutions, not about people, not about one agency, but institutions like project implementation unit, which can be established in Kyiv by the certified experts of our IFIs, that can be guaranteed that everything will be sustainable. Because today we are recovery one things, and then today government can change and they can have different approach. Someone should take this as a guarantee that next governments will do the same issue like we had before, for example, in Germany after World War II, when they had this platform and then it was sustainable for 20 years and recovered the countries. I hope that we will be able to do the same in Ukraine.
Thank you. And I know we'll hear a little bit more about digitalization and tech and innovation that it's driving, not just in Ukraine, but really on a global scale a little bit later this afternoon. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. It's clear that this effort is going to take partnership between the US government, the government of Ukraine, individual companies that are operating in Ukraine, the business sector as a whole. We look forward to partnering with all of you and to continuing this conversation. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you so much.